Have you ever wondered why, after the secret of the Death Star gets out, Lonnie spills the beans to Luthen, Dedra captures Axis, Luthen, but then loses him at the last minute. The secret they're trying so desperately to hold on to is falling apart at the seams, and Krennic himself comes down to interrogate Dedra. Why? And this is the question I had after thinking about this. Why? I'm sure there are a lot of other people who could do that. Why not send someone else? While the entire ISB is falling apart, surely there's something more important for Krennic to do. And, thinking about it, it's obvious because he doesn't trust anyone, but you think more on that and ask why not? And you realize that looking at this whole affair, especially as the story of Andor moves into Rogue One, the rebellion got incredibly lucky that Partegaz took the fall for everything, that it was his responsibility that ultimately ended up with the Death Star secret getting out and that Krennic walked free. The rebellion got very lucky because as we go into Rogue One, it became really clear to me that Partegaz was incredibly unique and the Empire lost someone that it couldn't replace and that it couldn't afford to lose. Some of my favorite scenes in Andor are the ISB meetings. And, I really didn't expect this and it kind of caught me off guard because it's just so much fun to watch Major Partegaz lead the ISB. I didn't expect to see strategy meetings about metrics and numbers. I also didn't expect them to be the highlight of the show or one of the highlights, but I love them. This is amazing world building and it kind of really shows you the behind the scenes in small snippets so that way it doesn't get boring. But also there's enough tension between the characters and everyone's on edge to where it really pulls you in and we get a better understanding of what it takes to run the Empire behind the scenes. Because, the ISB is kind of this backbone, the secret police that's keeping everything under wraps. All these dirty little secrets that the Empire is busy, creating, genocide over here, massacres over here, a slave prison over here. All of this is happening and functions because of what the ISB does, and it becomes very clear that Partegaz, the man at the helm, is a very good leader, and he understands what it takes to run this, run this lifeblood for the Empire. He understands what the ISB needs to become and its role.
We are healthcare providers. We treat sickness. We identify symptoms. We locate germs, whether they arise from within or have come from the outside. The longer we wait to identify a disorder, the harder it is to treat the disease.
And so we see Partegaz has built an institution. We see all this in all the ISB meeting scenes. Partegaz builds up people. Running an empire is a game of numbers. You simply can't be everywhere. You have to delegate. You have to manage. And this is the first thing you learn as an effective leader, is that you no longer do much of anything, especially leaders at a certain level. Doing is no longer for you. You have people that do that. You have people that do all the doing that needs because, there's simply not enough time. There's too much at stake. Your time as a leader is so important, you can't waste it. You can't spend it off going on, on this mission or that. You send someone else.
We can't take it all in. Go on. Many of us. Some of us. Some of us have more people in custody than we can process.
And because simply, there is no time. Imagine managing a team of 10 people. How many conversations you need to have simply to learn just what everyone on the team knows. Make sure everybody on the team knows what the other team is doing. Team A and Team B are doing this. Don't overlap. Don't, work against each other. Now, imagine your team of 10 is now replaced with 100. Now it's replaced by 1,000. And now, imagine you're responsible for what millions and billions of people are doing throughout the galaxy. This is what it means to run the Empire. And this is the world building that Andor has done such a good job because we actually see behind, see on the inside, see how the sausage gets made. And the Empire is always continually creating its own problems, or that it, or specifically the ISB, must solve, or else, it's in danger of falling apart, or bigger problems that are going to cascade and out from there.
The day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance, will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Remember this.
And, it'll eventually, if it's left unchecked, it'll go the way of the Republic from which it emerged. They have to control those underneath them, which causes this initial strife. We have the riots. We have individuals acting out. We have all of these things going on in the galaxy with the prison, with Ferrix, with, Luthen's backstory, all of these different things that come into play. And all of these have to be addressed because you can never give up control. You can never show weakness.
Some of us have more people in custody than we can process.
Supervisor Young raises a serious issue. The problem is not unknown to me. Colonel Yularen and myself have a meeting scheduled with the Emperor to discuss amplifying our intake process. Well played, Lonnie. Thank you for reminding us all how this room is meant to function.
And all of this, we can see this is the world that Partegaz is running in. This is the world. Everything is a reflection of him because the leaders really do set the tone for their underlings, for their company, for their teams. If you've ever worked in a toxic work environment, you can imagine, guess where it all stems from. You can really tell because either they're blind or they're stupid or it's intentional. And so we can see this as it feeds down for all of their people for each of the systems. We have Partegaz's system over here and we have Krennic's. And just imagine this, the single act that Partegaz did that really changed everything for the story of Andor is that he listened to Dedra. He listened to her at the right time. And so what happens because of that? She finds Axis. She figures out that Axis even exists. Imagine if she hadn't. Imagine that, Deidre's off, been sent off to who knows where because she's good at her job. She's kind of annoying and she's going on about this conspiracy theory. So we're going to send her off to go hunt down pirates or something like that. But Axis is then allowed to continually freely erode the Empire from the inside out. Eventually the news of the Death Star would get out. The ISB would fall apart. Luthen has this spy in the middle of the ISB that, it's like, how did he actually make this happen? How did he get these connections? All of these things. What else could he be capable of? Axis is all going about his own plans. Luthen Rail is wandering around freely. And all of this happens if Partegaz doesn't listen to the people working for him, to his team. And this is the problem that the Empire eventually faces, is that with Partegaz's death, his philosophy, his influence, all of that dies with him. Everyone from the ISB cuts ties and goes their own way. And again, his way of managing is not perfect. We can see this flaws in the, many of the flaws in the system, but just as an effective functionary in this evil empire, Partegaz has a specific role, and he plays it out so differently from some of the others. For example, Krennic, as Krennic comes in and takes over the remains, and this really seems to lead into this classic view that we have of the Empire's functionaries.
Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, Lord Vader. Your sad devotion to that ancient religion has not helped you conjure up the stolen data tapes, or given you clairvoyance enough to find the rebels' hidden fort.
And so we have these key differences between the two because, Partegaz is looking to build the ISB and therefore build the Empire into a greater entity. He is a true believer of the system, and he's building this, almost without ego. It really doesn't seem that it's about him. It's about the mission. It's about treating the disease. It's not about the spotlight. It's not about an individual, single individual being right, because control is what matters, and you have to constantly maintain and constantly build a system that can control a galaxy. Otherwise, you will never be able to keep up, because every time you crack down on one riot, two more pop up in its place, and it becomes a numbers game. And this is this also sets up this fight between the functionaries and the systems, because there are those that are highly competent and capable. Krennic fully lives this out. He's very capable, but it is all about him succeeding. The goal is that the Empire achieves everything at once with him at the helm. It's not about the Empire. It's not about that. It's about him being at the helm of the Empire, with him at the lead. And Partegaz plays this perfect shadow leader. He's willing to share the spotlight. He's, there's a scene between Partegaz and Dedra. He wants Dedra to succeed. He's setting her up to go on and do awesome work, evil work. But, he's setting her up. He's setting up his little, his apprentices, and he's sending them out in all directions because this is what it takes. This is what it means to run an empire, because Partegaz doesn't need to know what to do. He doesn't need to look in all directions. He has people for that. That's what the ISB meetings, he's basically telling them, what do you guys think we should do? And he's correcting them. He's managing the philosophy, pointing them in the right direction, helping guide them. He's not talking about solving, he's not there to solve all of the problems and then, give the obvious solution to his useless or headless cronies and, prove to them how smart he is. He's asking them, he's pushing them, forcing them to solve it. They are the ones who are running the ISB. He's simply in charge of running them because, being in the spotlight isn't as important as results. Who cares about the limelight if the patient dies?
Let's get to work.
And this goes into the issue with Krennic, is that while he does use people, he does control them, he has his people, he doesn't trust them. There's a transaction to all of his dealings, and this is what control means to him. This gives him the need to belittle and bully others, his ability to demean those underneath of him, because ultimately all of this is about how he looks. And so in order to do that, you have to have constant control. You can't trust people because they will let you down. And we see this in Rogue One because you can see how much of his time is spent fighting off Tarkin. The other time is spent running around the galaxy to personally see to a number of matters. He has people, but he seems to see them as utterly useless or untrustworthy. And the problem is, he might be right. But again, whose fault is that? Whose responsibility is it that the Empire has competent leaders, that he has competent people underneath him? And I believe if you swapped Krennic and Partegaz in Rogue One, the story would take a very, very different turn. I think that if the rebellion isn't outright crushed, it would have been completely crippled. But for that point, do let me know down in the comments below if you think I'm right. If you swapped Krennic and Partegaz, what do you think would have happened? And this is the thing, for the story-wise, as a writing, Krennic plays the role of the villain perfectly for what the story wants, which, it wants an arrogant, evil, smug, punchable face sort of guy. And ultimately he falls due to the heroism of the protagonist and his own arrogant flaws because he can't see or, can't see what's underneath him. But again, imagine if Partegaz were here. Ruthless efficiency from an endless stream of bureaucrats who are driven by results. And this is, it is a flaw in the Empire, one of the many flaws, of course, in the Empire to force Partegaz to this point, one of the many sacrifices of office politics. And because, again, this is the power politics that the Empire is run on, that if this fails, whether or not they did everything they could, they simply failed, and that's enough. And so now, as we're looking as Partegaz, commits suicide, imagine if Krennic was driven to end his career the way Partegaz did. Do you think he would go quietly? He'd shoot everyone around him or order them to do it. He'd blame them. It would be their fault. He would shout and scream for all to hear. There would be probably, more than a few innocent, quote unquote, people, shot for various reasons. And Krennic would go down kicking, denying all responsibility. And it's this, this view, this worldview, this philosophy and responsibility towards the end of both of their lives impacts their ability to do anything. It's why Rogue One, he spends all this time running around doing things himself. Why does he need to go get Galen Erso himself? Now, you could say that's because the writers really want this scene. They really wanted this scene to get this line to come out just the right way.
You're a hard man to find, Galen. But farming. Really? Man of your talents?
But regardless of why the writers did this, they wrote this character this way, and it tells us that Krennic doesn't have, this trusted adjunct to sit in his place. He doesn't have a Dedra. That's why he goes himself. And what it tells the audience is that there's a single individual at the top of the pyramid, a single point of failure. There's no one giving Krennic advice, telling him what he needs to look out for. It's all up to him. It's not a system. It's not an institution. It's just one person. And if he misses anything, no one will do anything about it. And it really also acts in a sense. The tricky part also is for Rogue One, it makes the Empire feel like it's just one guy and then faceless people in all, incompetent faceless people in all directions, which it can be true in a lot of systems. It really makes sense, but this is what makes the Empire in Andor just feel so much more evil, feels so much more efficient and scary because they're just so much more capable. And this is ultimately what helps cause these systems to fail. They don't allow for failure. Do one screw up and you have all these people with knives out ready to stab you in the back. It drives people to succeed, but at the same time, what it does for a lot of people, they end up choosing people around them based on loyalty rather than competence. We do see this play out in history. I remember the scene from Chernobyl.
Yes, very good. There has been an accident at Chernobyl, but I've been assured there is no problem.
I'm telling you that there is.
I prefer my opinion to yours.
I'm a nuclear physicist. Before you were deputy secretary, you worked in a shoe factory.
Yes, I worked in a shoe factory. And now I'm in charge.
I was manager of a shoe factory, and it's just like, and now I'm in charge of a nuclear plants, or, in charge of this, that, and the other. Why? Because I'm a good communist, because I'm loyal. And so what you wind up with is a large selection of loyal, but altogether useless for anything outside the normal. They learn to think within a clear box with no outside imagination. Employees follow the rules. They are all hammers in search of a nail. And the second something unique or different comes up, they're completely at a loss.
Final warning, Hallcraft. Power down immediately or risk full consequences. Countermeasures armed.
What is that?
No, from a Hallcraft.
This is, the war between the philosophies inside the Empire. You have those people who almost believe in the mandate of control for a greater purpose, for their department, for the ISB, for the Empire itself. This is the worldview of Werner Herzog's character in The Mandalorian. The Empire breathes life. And in order to sustain that, in order to build that up, you have to have control. And then this is like the philosophical side of the Empire against inside the Empire itself as well. There's these goons, the thugs, these type of people who are after power for the sake of power of itself, for themselves. And this seems to be, from my understanding, the war that's always going on in these systems, because this is what they're offering. This is what they're promising to the people who join on. They offer control. Every individual can get their own piece of power so long as they use it in the name of the Empire. And the problem is that ultimately they serve the Empire as a service to themselves. They want the power that it offers, which is why they will always choose themselves over the Empire.
Tell me now! Tell me what to do! Let's hear it, boss!
I expect you not to rest until you can assure the Emperor that Galen Erso has not compromised this weapon in any way.
So I'm still in command? You'll speak to the Emperor about it.
And so taking a step back, the Empire really is nothing more than an extremely and ungodly large corporation that as it expands, it loses its ability to improvise. It loses its ability to adapt and pivot. But this is what you have to have in order to survive. Again, this size, how big it is, this is what's necessary to control galaxy and billions upon billions of people. But this is why, initially they don't see anything. They don't see Andor. They don't see Leviathan. They can't see these little bitty things happening because they lose all of this nuance. And all they do, and all they know how to do is to enact control. And we see that, all the way down from the functionaries, everyone down. It's incredible. It's a 9-to-5 job. All this control. We're just, moving along. And it's this great world building that we get to see all of this come into play. But eventually, of course, the Empire becomes so blind that there's, this almost internal war between those, trying to figure out and trying how to maintain this control to keep everyone underneath in line. It's why Axis's accidental final act of service to the rebellion ended up being the removal of Partegaz. Him getting the secret out for the Death Star caused Partegaz to get removed from power, effectively removing the eyes and ears of the Empire and allowing the rebellion this breath of air, and they were able to take full advantage of it. In my head, I always imagine for going into Rogue One that the reason why, the transition from Andor to Rogue One, the reason why there's such a collapse in intelligence and, momentum from the Empire is because the ISB has just completely been gutted. Can you imagine? Again, imagine if Partegaz replaced Krennic in Rogue One. Krennic's running around doing all this stuff, but instead it's Partegaz, and he's sending people, true believers who understand control and have this subtle approach to control, who aren't just the goons, who aren't self-serving, that they're building this towards a greater vision of the Empire. Because again, this is what they believe in. This is what they spend all of their time. How would things look differently if it was Partegaz instead of Krennic? So yeah, let me know what you guys think. Please do like and subscribe. It very much does help the channel out, and I appreciate it. We've got a whole bunch of new people here, and I think that's awesome. I really love to see what you guys think. Let me know down in the comments below what you guys think. Would it have made a difference? Was Partegaz just a dime a dozen, or was he really something special and something unique? And what would it have done in Rogue One if the two had been swapped? So let me know down in the comments what you think. I am Jeff Cassidy. This is Fiction Applied, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.